I'm Gordon Wheeler. I come from Esalen, that's where I've been for the last 20 years. I didn't really come from there. And we talk a lot about creativity at Esalen. It's one of the things we've been consistently occupied with for almost 60 years. And I'd like to talk to you, share some of my thoughts about creativity, coming off of our many talks about fertile void and creative indifference, and the current predicaments that we find ourselves in as a world, as a species. So when I say my thoughts, that's just a kind of convenient fiction. You know, our thoughts are never only our own thoughts. This is my rumination about things that I've experienced conversationally, dialogically, in lectures like we've just been having here, readings. Over the last 50 years, this is something, my way of trying to make sense of it. So before plunging into that, I wanted to say just for a minute about about our contact here. That's why I asked them to turn the light down. I so need to see your faces, which I can now, so that's great. It's an odd sort of a contact, isn't it? I mean, it's familiar to us from school and all, but this kind of supposedly one-way download, which never serves me very well, because I feel like, I mean, it really serves me to work on preparing a talk, but then I feel like, oh, now I know a little more about what I think on that subject because of talking to you in my head. But what I really want is to hear from you. But of course, I have to tell you some of those thoughts in order to hear back. But I'm really going to try to keep this to a length that will allow for some questions, at least afterwards. And I think that certainly serves my attentional process, and it may serve yours if you're thinking about what you might like to ask now or later. I can put my email over there on the board. I'd love to have your questions anytime if you have thoughts or challenges or corrections or better ways to say things. That's the point, you know. It's like as a writer or as a teacher, to me it's always just a half or less of a conversation, because it's the rest of it that then nourishes me, and that's the exchange that we have. Hopefully there's something that nourishes you in my part, but in any case, I'll get that out of it. And that's a challenge for me to shrink down to time boundaries. I say that because both my wife, Nancy, is here, who'll kind of go, you know, and my fiercest and best editor. I've had, I don't know, dozens of editors in my life, but the best, who really sets friendship aside, is Malcolm Varla, an old friend, and many of us here have benefited from his editing over the years, as well as his own writing, because of the British Gestalt Journal and other work that he's done. And I just popped into my head to tell a funny story about that. From when you visited me, Malcolm, almost 20 years ago, and I was quite ill and really felt like I was dying. They told me I was, but they were momentarily mistaken. And but I was having a series of chemo treatments that were a week long every month for a series. So Malcolm came to town in Boston, right on the day I was going back into the hospital for another week of this toxic stuff, but you know, toxic elixir that did its job. And Malcolm was hoping to edit this article I had written about a case of dementia of my aunt, as John was citing yesterday about his mother, and her confusion and what survived in her and what was self and what was narrative and what was personality, and kind of using that very personal kind of article. And I'd sent it to the British Gestalt Journal because I felt that's the journal with imagination to see that this might possibly be relevant to our discussions of self. So Malcolm was quite determined to edit this article, which, you know, was quite personal. It needed a lot of editing. So he started, and I couldn't, you know, I couldn't really focus. But his demand brought me more alive. So we got partway through it line by line. He was really helping. And then he came with us to the hospital then, as the three of us went on over to the hospital. And once I got in the bed and hooked up with the IVs and all, he came out with the next page and we went on with it. And, it was, I felt there was such life, I felt so appreciative, so honored, and, called to participate and still be there. Kind of with one foot already out the door. And so I've never really thanked you for that. We've teased each other about it a couple of times over the years. Thank you, Malcolm. And he turned it into, I think, my favorite of all the articles or chapters I've ever written, which must be, I don't know, a couple of hundred, but it really should say by Wheeler and Parlett. So, but it bears on this question of trying to contain myself in time boundaries, which has frustrated editors of mine for years. And I've thought about it before, and I thought about what it goes back to. And I know what happens to me when I get impassioned about a subject, is I still want you to understand and see what I'm getting at, so that you can respond and give me back another step along that path. Because I really only like to give talks about what I'm wrestling with right now, and not about if I give a talk about something I've already kind of published or something, I put myself to sleep, and no doubt you as well. But what happens is, it touches a very early, I'm sure pre-verbal part of myself, and this will be relevant in what we're going to talk about adaptations and their role in programming the brain. A part of myself that did not expect to be listened to, or attuned to, or attended to, or understood. And even though in my own family, nobody was being very mean or abusive, they were very preoccupied, depressed, some substance problems, but not meanness, but not a hell of a lot of attention. And once I learned to talk, everything got much better. They were talkers. I could really kind of get on my way, and that was supported and favored, and I've been, I guess, talking ever since. And I don't really feel that so consciously anymore after all these years, that I won't be. I feel like, I don't know if I'll make myself clear, but I'll be engaged with. And that will be, we'll get somewhere. And we'll go back and forth, and it'll be fun and exciting and difficult and enlightening and rich. But I have trouble with the time boundaries, and that I'm sure goes back to that. That's why I say I know it's pre-verbal, because verbal development helped me a lot with this issue of not feeling paid attention to. But the pre-verbal still comes up in that I have such trouble managing the time boundaries. So you'll have to help me. It's just, how can you help me? Nancy can go like this. Different parts of, I'm just going to say a few things of my thoughts to make that space when I get into something and go on too long. So I really, really am asking you to think about questions you might ask afterwards in the time we'll have, or send in. That really means a lot to me. So I want to talk about creativity. What do we mean by creativity, and where does it come from? So by creativity, as I'm going to use it, it means an innovation that is sustainable. So when we talk about a creative adaptation, we solved a problem. That's a Gestalt faith, very different from some other methods. To me, that's at the core of our Gestalt model, our Gestalt understanding of the brain-mind. It's of Lewin's work, of Pearls and Goodman's work, that we are approaching the world as problem-solving, and with the best conditions the field allows at a given moment, as perceived by us. And by field, I mean the whole inner field of past experience and preferences and fears and all of that, and the outer field of supports to go this way or not supports as I perceive it subjectively. So it's totally embedded in the relational world, and it's a unique individual perspective. I think that's what really sets Gestalt apart as a theory, is this ability to hold the always pre-existing ultimate relatedness, social relatedness, and then as well as with nature, of the individual and the individuality. Those are the poles of our life. That's the dynamic that we live in that defines us. Many other species are much more defined just by the holism of the species. Gestalt is not holism. It's an element, but it's something very, very distinct from that. So, where does our creativity, I mean, we have certain hallmarks as a human species. We're the most complexly relational species, complexly, that is in a differentiated way, not just a mass way like ants or bees. And we are the most creative, those are very related, it turns out, and we're the most individual. So it sounds a little paradoxical, we would say it's a polarity. But those polarities define life. If you're not connected, if you're a living entity, you're connected with the world or you die. You're not a living entity. But if you're not with a boundary, provisionally, as a sort of useful fiction, then you're not an entity. You're not a living, that's what biologists look for, is a defined, bounded element, don't even say organism yet, which can act in its own regard, like a kind of a microbe that follows up a sugar gradient or anything like that. That's how they know it's alive. It's following its own interest. So where does our creativity come from? Well, I want to take you on a little side journey here. And I thought we would do like 5 million years in 5 minutes, if somebody would keep track of that, see if we can do it. Because we come from a species that came down out of the trees around 5 million years ago, round numbers. Very closely related to chimps and bonobos, but we diverged at that point from them. And we're descended from bipedal, I mean bonobos are pretty bipedal, you know, two-legged, not walking on two legs, because as the forest, we're descended from that subspecies, because as the forests shrunk in a long cooling and dry period, way back then, and that many million years ago, in Africa, there were fringe groups of the arboreal, the tree species of chimpanzees and others, who tried to make it out on the edges of the shrinking forest. But that poses a lot of problems. First of all, you've got to be bipedal to forage in the open savanna, because the distances are too great. Knuckle walkers, chimpanzees walk on their knuckles. They can't, it's very wearing on them. They can do it, but it's not a way they could live. But food is much more dispersed on the savanna than in the fruit trees. So you've got to be able to do that to collect your food. So the species has to be bipedal to move out into the open. But once you move out into the open and you're not sleeping in trees, you're defenseless. And we're very weak and defenseless individually. So that puts a huge pressure on social organization. So the social group that's moving out from the trees is got to grow, because it takes more for that much differentiated protective labor. Who's going to watch the infants while this one is out doing the hunting or the gathering? Things like that. The size of the troop has to grow, and the complexity of the relationships has to grow, because you've got to have this one and this one and this one detailed to do that, and you've got to have all these other complications, and all of that without language. We manage all that if you get to 100 to 150 people, the number of possible subgroupings within that, like one with these 87 and 14 with those two guys, that number is greater than the number of particles in the known universe. Can't tell you what the number is. My son worked it out for me. He's a mathematician. But, it has, you'd have to know the name of the number of zeros after it, one followed by some Google plus of zeros. It's an amazing amount of complexity. Chimpanzees can't do it. They fragment at about 40. When the troop grows more than that, they have to split. Humans, 40 couldn't make it out on the savannah, so we have this constant pressure for being capable of more social complexity. That's what drives the explosive growth of the prefrontal cortex, which is part of the part of the brain that integrates other brain inputs, not direct outside contact, it's integration. That's where complexity becomes possible. So we have this explosive growth of the prefrontal cortex and the head, which puts pressure on the birth canal, because the head can only be so big to get out of the mother's body. And the birth canal of a bipedal creature is much more limited than a quadruped, because the hips have to be more in a straight up and down line to support bipedalism. Does that make sense? Kind of racing through this. We could spend days on it. I'm afraid I would, left to myself. And so what you have, the solution evolutionarily, is a more and more premature infant. So humans, if you scale the mammals and their relation of size and length of pregnancy, all of our babies, for where we fall in the chain of size of mammals, all of our babies should be born 3 to 6 months later than they are. Everybody is at least 3 months premature. And what that means is the baby can come out before the prefrontal cortex has started to achieve its full growth. And that also means before it is programmed up. Well, what programs the frontal cortex in another mammal? Instincts. Those are inherited patterns of behavior. And it's not just biases or, I like touch and I move towards touch. It's a whole chain of behaviors that are set out, that are either inborn or learned on only 1 or 2 presentations, so the tendency is inborn. And at basically 1 or 2 presentations of the stimulus. So the whole animal world is very characterized by instincts. We are relatively, almost completely free of instincts in that technical sense. So where are we going to get all that? We've got to have all kinds of behavior patterns in our, as I've sometimes said, structured ground, dynamically structured ground, to support any moment of contact. And we get that, as we know, from early childhood, family culture, and the wider culture around. My adaptation, for instance, to going on and on about every detail is something that was programmed in a very deep way, ingrammed into my brain as a neuron chain in the preverbal period by my particular family culture. So I've recovered from a lot of the effects of it, but not entirely. I still, obviously, still want more time to explain myself. So that would be an example of how that marks you so much. And the way we handle all that blank complexity as human beings is, we creatively adapt to a situation. There's a creative solution. And if that works, at least gets us away from the phobic stimulus or whatever it is, then we begin to automate that as a long behavior chain. And when that kind of thing presents, that's the way our brain works. There's nothing wrong with that. Those are not necessarily fixed gestalts. They are dynamic preferential patterns in the brain and soon in our social world, because we move in a way that tends to anchor them both places. So somebody comes up and speaks to me with a challenging question. I've got all kinds of brain patterns from past experience that come into that. Is that a good thing? Is that a terrifying thing? Do I need to get out of there? Is it a trauma reaction, which is the extreme of the fixed gestalt? One trigger, gotta get away from it. So our adaptations, our creative adaptations, may be more or less rigid or flexible. That all depends on the field conditions at the time they were formed. Think about a baby learning to walk. Is this on? Is this on? I don't know. No, I turned on. Oh, I think you can hear me. I was just showing a baby's learning to walk, and you know how they are. I don't know how to turn it on. Someone know how? I can do it from here. Because you all know what it looks like to watch a baby learning to walk. They're shaking all over the place. They're sitting down all the time. If you speak to, they're concentrated, they're walking, they don't realize it yet. Then you speak to them, they fall down. And it's fun and touching to watch. And, but gradually they're integrating that, and which means it's becoming a habit chain that they can rely on. They're no longer thinking they're no longer attending, it's maybe not thinking, to balance and all these things. After a while, a short while really, in that period, they can, it would be nice if it could turn on, but. Is this on? Yeah, oh great. So and then they're walking, and then when you walk, you don't think about it. But what field conditions were those learned under? If you lived in a family or a culture that was very hesitant about moving forward into the world, you might walk one way. If you live in a family where you're required to be extremely vigilant to constantly changing unpredictable conditions, or a wider world like that, you may be leading like this, and you'll have back problems from that all through life, because we're walking in a supported manner where your skeleton and your muscles are doing the work of holding you up. You're working against yourself. I mean, it's a very good metaphor for all kinds of problems where we've made a creative adaptation to deal with that situation. It's out of date, but we haven't changed it, or we've changed parts of it, but we're not aware that some aspects of that linger as a fixed pattern. So that's, we're talking about that all the time in Gestalt, and that's what therapy has to do with in many, many methods, not only in Gestalt. It's creating the supportive, what do you need in order to change that or create something different? Any creative act is conditioned in the field conditioners, or as field conditions we often say, but Lynn Jacobs told us a couple of years ago at Esalen at a conference, she said, in order to think of that word, because she didn't like the sort of third personal psychology of analyzing somebody's field conditions or something. It's not that intersubjective. She said, I can understand it if I say field conditioners, sort of these different patterns and experiences in the inner experience and out here that are shaping what's easier to do and what's harder to do in that particular area. So that's the kind of thing that will stay with us, or we can bring it up in therapy or other places for revision. But what does it take to do that? People have talked about it in this conference and always in Gestalt over and over and over. It takes extra support. You need extra safety. You need extra empathic resonance, which relaxes some of the defenses in the therapeutic session, but it can also be with a friend. You feel understood, you feel a somatic relaxation, and you're able to have thoughts and make connections and be undefensive in a way that you weren't before, because you're safer than you were back in the conditions when that rigid adaptation was formed. So everything that is, this is Gestalt field theory, everything that is has to be supported by the current field. Now by support, I don't just mean nice, friendly things. A negative condition can be a support for not going there, for going over here. So that's a field idea of supports. We sometimes get that confused, that supports are too soft and namby-pamby, and we shouldn't have too many of them. Burroughs, I think, had some of that feeling when he talked about the growth and maturity being the transition from dependency to self-supports. That has a little bit of that phobic idea about supports in them, and that you should give the client only as much support, Laura Pearls is big on this, as is absolutely needed, and no more, and take it away as fast as you can. That's, I mean, I think when you're raising kids, I think I've always been a kind of slightly hovering parent. But they throw you off. It gives them something to push against and get away from. And so really, it's not that dangerous, a little bit of it doesn't coddle all the life out of them. It might, but it'd be in the extreme. So that would be a Gestalt field theory of behavior, that whatever is supported by the current field. And when we can relax and begin to examine that inside you and in the conditions around, we can begin to understand the behavior. That doesn't take away responsibility. Responsibility in the sense of Schmidt's, it does not in Gestalt. Responsibility is finding the, without trying to solve the puzzle of free will, we're looking toward the thing in an intervention that I'm actually able to do. Look to the achievable change. If I can't just forget my trauma panic, can I imagine my assailant, my assaulter, in Berlin, say, or in Rome, at that distance, and then learn to relax and feel my body and feel my therapist and see your face in that process. That's that gradual trauma deactivation, and then maybe next week I can imagine them in Milan, at that distance. And so you start with where you can, and it's that intentionality, that capacity to direct our attention. I'm going to say choicefully, although that's a problematic word because that also has a lot of determined elements in it. That brings us back to our emphasis on responsibility that Bob and others have been talking about. That's so important. But it also gives us a more complete Gestalt theory of change, because if what is supported in the field, in some inner and outer at the moment, otherwise it would die away. I mean, we have a lot of old habits that just die away because they're no longer relevant. They're not dynamically supported by anxiety, distancing, by inner feeling of rewards, by shame, different ways that are vectors in our field that the behavior is coming out of, even though we're not conscious of them a lot of the time. If we want to see a change in behavior, we could call that a map of supports, theoretically, just as a metaphor. If we want to change our behavior, we have to change that map of supports. In therapy, we often work a lot on the inner map of supports. If you work more on the outer supports, that, some people might call that more a coaching model, but they're certainly they're not absolutely distinct from each other. In any therapy, from time to time, they'll refer to situations, people, support stagers outside of the room. And even the coach will work with, well, where does that fear come from? And that kind of thing. So they do the boundary is permeable. Where are we time-wise? Gotta get to the end. I just want to point out that this model of a brain process that, as Lewin described, regards perception as a form of problem solving. And he also said there's no perception without interpretation. In other words, the field is always there. Your past predilections, your beliefs, your conclusions, your fears, your aspirations, your somatic feelings are entering into your perception and directing it, directing your attention. So that's why he says there's no absolutely objective perception. There's always an element of value in there, a preferential direction of your intention. So it's that model of the brain as a challenge model, a problem-solving, coping from thing to thing to thing, that has emerged that's the Gestalt model from 100 years ago, particularly as refined by Lewin, who really developed the idea of experiment, which then Goodman and Pearls applied so clearly to the therapeutic situation. Lewin applied it more to social situations. He's the founder of organizational psychology, and action research is an experiment. You perform an experiment not to solve a problem with a client. It may solve a problem, it may give them practice in doing something differently. But the real objective of the experiment is to see what happens. It's a probe into, it's like a stress test. You stress the metal to see where the weak spots are. You probe the behavior, or the opposite of the behavior, or doing more of the behavior, whatever it is, in order to begin to reveal the dynamic structures that are underneath it that are out of sight. We've paid so much productive attention in Gestalt over the last 60 and more years to figure and how figure is formed, this contact cycle, what gets in the way, how do people not satisfy their own desires and frustrate themselves, what can we do about that? This is a way, at least to my mind, of talking about ground, the field of preferential supports that lies under the figure or behind it, and is also preconditioning it, because certain things we're not going to notice because of our inner field of preferences that would stand out to somebody else, or vice versa. We'll notice them more. So that's how it happens that the Gestalt model of brain-mind in relation to behavior is the contemporary neuroscience model. That's what they're working on. That's the presumption of how brain structure process works. It really comes out of Gestalt work of a century ago. And some neuroscientists know that. And I always like to cite this wonderful terminology that I take from Dan Siegel of interpersonal neurobiology, which they know some at the beginning to know more about now, about how I'm talking to you, I'm looking into your face. Our brains are affecting each other. Not just our minds, our experience is affecting each other, but it's actually leaving a trace in our brain. And of empathy or non-understanding or whatever we're projecting into each other's faces. Just looking, I'm looking at you right here. And so that's interpersonal neurobiology, which is a wonderfully Gestalt idea to me. So there we have this most creative animal, human, who is constantly solving problems, has become non-local by moving out of the trees, and now the tribe itself, as I was saying, is social complexity that's driving that rapid growth of the brain over the next 1 to 2 million years after they leave the trees. The tribe itself becomes the evolutionary microcosm for developing, and different human troops around the enormous continent of Africa would be developing slightly differently. Then, so you've got all this fertile evolutionary pressure cooker environment for the evolution of the more and more complex brain, driven by social complexity. When the complexity is too great, we're constantly automating the new creative solutions, so that's how we're able to handle not having instincts. Now, that's a wonderful, thrilling picture. They're no longer, they can go all over the world because they're taking their own environment of survivability with them and creating new tools and shelter and clothing and stuff to go into different habitats, different environmental conditions. And then, about 75,000 years ago, is the emergence of language, the next second declension, kind of paradigm shift in our evolutionary history as a species. I mean, we probably had signs and grunts and names, but syntactic language is another thing again, and it frees you from time. So now you're in a sense freed from space, you can live anywhere, and you're freed from time, you can talk about anything. That's what you can do with syntax, is say, you know, yesterday I thought this, but then you walked in and it all changed, And you can't do that with just pointing language. And I think that, you know, when the rains come, it'll be months from now, then I think we'll have to notice, and if the hillside is already brown up there, that'll mean we have an early winter, so we'll migrate this. You can't have that kind of conversation until you have syntactic language, which is evidently, and this is reassuring to me, not, as far as I can tell, it doesn't make a structural change in the shape of the brain physically that is at least palpable in the fossil remains. It's a little hard to know. But it seems to be more of a software reorganization than a hardware installation. And that gives us hope, because the last thing I want to say is there's a shadow over all this picture of great progress, and you know, we know where it's heading. It's heading to our exhaustion of the planet, the meeting of all the different, there's no more open space to move to, there's no new environment to exploit and destroy. And the shadow of our human nature is when the environment is too changeable and the field is overwhelming to us and we cannot cope with it all. We have a built-in tendency, you can see this all through human prehistory, we have a built-in default for too much complexity. And that default is, I divide the field into us and them. My troop that are living and interacting so complexly and so creatively together, and that other one. And you see what that does. It doesn't just split the outer field, it also temporarily defers or resolves all the interpersonal problems. I don't need to know anything about you except you're on my team. We're so different, but we don't have to deal with that. It's like in the United States, we had so much labor unrest and socialistic movements in the 30s. Then along came the war, and the message was, one for all for one, put your shoulder to the wheel, we'll deal with all those questions of social justice afterwards. Of course, we haven't gotten to afterwards yet because we had a new emergency declared, like, oh no, sorry, the war's not over, we're in the Cold War now, it's nuclear arms, very desperate situation. We'll deal with all that, those social issues later. Well, now that's really biting us all in the butt, you know, in developed societies all over the world, because we never have really dealt with those issues. And so here we are. So I want to say thank you for Kathleen for bringing up Schmitz, because you don't have to be a Holocaust doubter to agree with him on one point that I understand he makes, which is that history is full of holocausts. Human history is the history of one troop exterminating another. In the Bible, the Hebrew Bible, God tells them, bring me 10,000 foreskins. I forget which enemy. It's, in other words, stamp them out as an ethnicity. There'll be no more children from the males of that opponent. And that's just the way we look, and we don't have to look very far. I mean, I'm from America. I'm 132nd, I think it is, Cherokee. Those are the survivors of that genocide. And then, of course, I also have, we have African-American grandchildren, mixed-race grandchildren, the descendant of the survivors of that semi-genocide, the slavery. And we all, you know, all our countries have that. It's all those, you know, there were a couple million years ago, 3 and 4 million years ago especially, there were dozens and dozens, we don't know how many, because they emerge every month, of different human subspecies that we didn't know it. We used to think it was kind of a tree. And then we thought, no, it's an evolutionary bush. We know it's a hedgerow or a forest now. There's so many different groups that sprang up. And why is there only one today? You know? That's part of it is interbreeding, but most of it is extermination. Somebody's troop cooperated better, was better at social complexity internally than the other one, and so therefore they could defeat the other one. They could operate more effectively. So that's the shadow that's hanging over us. That's a challenge of our times, of these desperate, desperate times that we live in. So I got 10 minutes for you. I'm only, 20 minutes behind my schedule? But I've got 10 minutes to hear from you. That's the last thing I'll say, which is our time demands not just creativity, but a species evolutionary leap analogous to the coming down out of the trees or the development of syntactic language. We have to find in our brain reprogramming some kind of expansion of consciousness and complexity that enables us to embrace the whole world as part of our tribe. That's the issue of belonging, the opposite of shame. Dynamically, the experiential opposite of shame is belonging. We don't feel belonging with all those people. We say all those poor children in the refugee boats in what is it, Lampedusa and all, that they're drowned in the Mediterranean. But I don't say all my poor children, because it's somebody. Even though I'm sympathetic, it's somebody else's. We have to have a different consciousness. I think that's what all this mindfulness practice is about today. It's an attempt to develop a different consciousness in much of that in the more privileged parts of society, but it's desperately needed here. Otherwise, we're just left in a descending inferno of Trump and Brexit and all the other fascisms. I mean, what is fascism? It's a reaction against the over-complexity and the extreme inequality of modern life, industrialized life, postmodern life, post-industrial age, which leaves so many out, as so many presenters have said, the left behinds. That's what we've got to find, what we've got to work on. And that means way, way more field supports to support that degree of human change. Thank you. I hope somebody has a question, because we have a few minutes, right? There's someone is going around with a mic. If anyone has a comment, a question, a challenge, a refutation. Deb.
I don't see the mic. You can repeat my question. That microphone.
Oh, sure.
I have one. Oh, sure.
We should change.
Only this, the last you said about this growing social complexity, and the winner is the one who can manage that social complexity, and the urgency of changing the culture. We had an experience yesterday globally of children taking the lead. Do we know how we can advance that more effectively as a community of Gestalt therapists and organizational consultants? Do you have ideas about how to accelerate our support of the urgency that the children expressed on their feet yesterday?
Yeah, it's such a wonderful, inspiring thing, and so many of us would be out there with them if we weren't here and mindful of not wanting to pose problems for our hosts here in a given political situation. We don't want to type them as in a certain position, but it's so inspiring that the young are taking this on and sort of saying, "Fuck you, we're not waiting for you old guys who are so slow." Well, the aspect of that goes with it is, it has to engender and reflect and go along with a consciousness change of who we are in relation to each other, who we are in relation to our Mother Earth. And so, I mean, then the strategic questions I don't have time or answer for now, but thank you so much for bringing that forward. Somebody? We got time for one more. Maybe two more.
Can you hear me? Oh, sorry. Gordon?
Oh, hey.
Hey. Just thinking, given your ask, which is about focusing on a different kind of consciousness, what's the rationale for therapy as a strategy when the complexity of the conditions clearly includes a vast amount of institutions and structures and cultures in the environment?
I love that. It's an old question and one that hasn't been answered very well. I mean, we have some familiar answers like, well, therapy, individual therapy tends to target the elite. The elite do tend to be influencers, so it's worth doing. But does it just take energy away? This is a big debate when I was young in school 60 and 55 years ago. Because when I first heard of Gestalt therapy, and then I heard of somebody named Goodman, Paul Goodman, who was an author, but I hadn't read the book. This would have been in like 1970. I had no idea that was the same Paul Goodman that had meant so much to my generation in growing up absurd and made us feel so, as a social activist, and a kind of call to arms that we felt from that. Someone who understood us at last, even though he was from an older generation than we were. And then when I found out that was one and the same person, the Gestalt Paul Goodman and the activist Paul Goodman, I thought, okay, I got to know more about that method because it's going to help see the whole picture. And I don't have an answer to your question, but I appreciate it. I hope if you have an answer, I'd love to know it. The role of therapy in this, does it add to social action or does it take away from it? 55 years ago, I would have said, oh, clearly that's a bourgeois activity that takes away from the streets. I think we need all these things. Last one? Yeah, please.
Thanks, Gordon. I'm really fascinated by what you've been saying, and I wonder what you think of Extinction Rebellion, which is a movement. It's calling itself the mother of all movements, and it was founded in London in 2017, and its premise is non-violent direct action and no blame, no shame as a way of operating, and having a background of well-being, people who support the front line. So there's something very, very optimistic for me in this movement, and I wonder what you think of it.
What's the name of the movement?
Extinction Rebellion.
Extinction Rebellion, yeah.
And it's a worldwide movement, starting in London 2017. It's in Ireland, it's in many places.
And it's like this youth movement of like, enough. Oops, sorry. It's like the youth movement, and it's just saying enough with all this. We just have to stop. I don't know how we get to the stop point, but I think that's a wonderful movement. And all these things, it's like there's 1,000 of these things going on, and we keep hoping, thinking this will tip. It'll spring. We'll see. A lot of us have coming elections. We'll see if that helps. But of course, it has to go deeper than the available choices too. I think our biggest enemy is ourselves, basically. But it's discouraged impassivity. I always feel like people say, well, what difference does it make to try to be, this is what we're trying to do at Esalen, is keep this activist profile alive. And people say, well, it's too late, it's not going to make a difference. And I always say, you can't know that. We don't know that our actions will not make the difference. We don't know. It's a very chaotic state. In a chaotic situation, a seed crystal can have enormous organizing power. Really, in a way, that's been the history of Esalen in the 60s, 70s, 80s, with Cold War issues and personal growth issues and a whole array of things. It was a seed crystal. We're trying to still do that today. I just say, God bless all these movements so that we don't just sink into despair. John.
I love the bit at the end where you said the whole world as part of our tribe. Yes?
Yeah.
And that in complexity we divide the field into us and them. The snag is we're just talking about it now.
I'm sorry, the last part?
The issue is we have us, who are Extinction Rebellion, and we have them, who have Donald Trump, that don't believe in it. So, what do we do? How do we accept those that we don't agree with? How do we bring them into our tribe rather than...
All I'm suggesting is, and it's not just me suggesting this, we have to remember that they are people who have their own experiences that have led them to things that we think are very wrong. And I'm not talking about a handful of Cheneys and Bannons, and if there's such a thing as evil, they have adopted it. But I'm talking about the millions who vote and vote for these regressive movements. But I think we have to change our attitude toward those people and not look down on them.
To me, that's the difficult bit. So it's easy to join Extinction Rebellion because I believe in it and to hate the other people, but it's how do we love those people that we disagree with? I think to me that's the massive challenge.
Well, all I can say is I agree. That's wonderful. The essence of debate is trying to articulate my position, but the essence of dialogue, of real communion, is listening. And then you begin to call forth a deeper, less assured voice from the other, who before you were typing as just monolithic. I was.
Thank you.
That's all I could say. Thank you all. Thank you so much.